I used to believe that if you worked hard, kept your head down, and did what you were told, things would eventually work out. That belief cost me 3 years of my life, 6 figures in legal exposure, and almost my sanity. The night everything finally collapsed, I was sitting alone in my apartment, eating cold takeout straight from the container, when my phone lit up with my boss's name. Again, 5th call in 10 minutes. I didn't answer. I already knew what he was going to say. Something had gone wrong. Something always went wrong. And somehow, it always landed on me. By the next morning, his face was on television, smiling, calm, confident, talking about accountability. What the audience didn't see were the emails sitting in my inbox, the ones marked urgent, confidential, and per our conversation. They didn't see the documents with my name on them instead of his. They didn't see the legal notices quietly sliding under my door while he gave interviews about leadership and integrity. They definitely didn't see the part where he told me, verbatim, that if I was as capable as everyone said, I should be able to handle the fallout on my own. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, and I was the part meant to absorb the damage. I didn't scream, I didn't threaten. I didn't march into anyone's office demanding justice. I did something much quieter, much more dangerous. I stopped fixing things, and when I did, everything, his reputation, his organization, his carefully curated public image, started to unravel in ways no one could explain. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the person holding everything together finally lets go, and what it costs the people who were never meant to fall. I didn't grow up wanting power. I wanted stability, a predictable paycheck, a job where my name didn't feel like a liability. So when Richard Hale offered me a position at his nonprofit, I thought I'd won some quiet, invisible lottery. Everyone knew his name. He was the kind of man who got introduced with extra adjectives: visionary, ethical leader, policy expert. The kind of guy whose quotes showed up on LinkedIn posts with a blue checkmark attached. He ran panels on cable news about transparency, accountability, and institutional reform. If there was a camera in the room, he knew exactly where to stand. And then there was me, 26, no famous school, no powerful family, a resume built on being reliable and detail-oriented, which is adult code for you will do the work no one else wants to touch. I was hired as an operations and compliance coordinator, which sounded important enough to impress my parents without actually giving me any authority. The first thing Richard said to me was, "I like you. You don't make things complicated." At the time, I took that as a compliment. My desk was 3 rows away from his glass office. I could see him pacing during calls, hands moving like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. When he laughed, people leaned in. When he frowned, meetings ended early. The entire place bent subtly around his mood. On my first week, I stayed late to finish reconciling vendor contracts. No one asked me to. I just didn't want to be the new hire who missed something obvious. Around 9 p.m., Richard walked past my desk, stopped, and looked genuinely surprised. "You're still here?" I shrugged. "Just cleaning up a few things." He smiled. "That's rare." That smile followed me home like a reward. From that point on, I became the person he trusted. If there was a deadline looming, it landed in my inbox. If a document needed review before a board meeting, it somehow arrived on my desk with 15 minutes to spare. If something went wrong, Richard didn't panic. He forwarded it to me with a single line. "Can you take a look at this?" And I did. Every time. At first, it felt good. Being needed is intoxicating when you've spent most of your life trying not to be a burden. I learned the systems faster than anyone else. I knew which board members hated surprises, which donors needed to be reassured, which compliance requirements were flexible, and which were landmines. I told myself I was learning, paying my dues, building trust. There was one thing I noticed early on, though. Richard never put his name on anything that might cause trouble. If there was a contract amendment involving gray areas, I was asked to finalize it. If a regulatory response needed to be drafted, I prepared the submission. If an internal review flagged inconsistencies, I was the one scheduled to walk the auditors through the process. Richard always framed it the same way. "You understand this better than I do." It sounded flattering until I realized what it actually meant. He didn't want to understand it. The first letter came about 8 months in, a formal inquiry from a regulatory body asking for clarification on a reporting discrepancy. It wasn't an accusation, exactly, more like a raised eyebrow in envelope form. I remember standing in the mailroom holding it, my stomach tightening as I read my name printed neatly under Responsible Party. I walked straight to Richard's office. He glanced at the letter, barely slowing his pace as he skimmed it. "Ah, yes, that." "You knew about this?" I asked. "Of course," he said easily. "It's nothing. These things happen." "But it's addressed to me." He looked up then, finally meeting my eyes. "That's because you handled the submission." I waited for him to say more, to explain, to reassure me that this was standard, that my name being there didn't mean anything. Instead, he clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "You're smart," he said. "You'll fix it." That was the first time I felt the shift. Not fear, exactly. More like the floor moving a few inches to the left when you weren't expecting it. Subtle. Disorienting. Easy to dismiss if you didn't want to look down. I fixed it. Of course I did. Drafted the response, attached the documentation, smoothed the language until it sounded clean and boring and compliant. The inquiry closed without further action. Richard sent me a thumbs-up emoji. I told myself that was just how things worked at that level. Leaders delegated, staff executed, accountability was shared. But over time, a pattern formed. Every potential risk stopped climbing once it reached him, and then slid sideways onto my desk. It was almost elegant. And here's the part that still makes me laugh, darkly, when I think about it now. I once joked to a coworker that if the building caught fire, Richard would give an interview about fire safety while I filled out the incident report. At the time, I thought I was exaggerating. I wasn't. By the end of my first year, I knew more about Richard Hale's organization than anyone who had ever appeared beside him on a stage. I knew where the numbers bent. I knew which reports were massaged before board meetings and which ones were buried entirely. I knew which donors needed real data and which ones just wanted the illusion of impact wrapped in the right language. I knew how to make things look clean without technically lying, a skill I wish I'd never learned. What I didn't know, at least not yet, was how replaceable I was meant to be. The workload didn't increase all at once. It crept. A task here, a favor there, a late-night email that started with, "Quick question," and ended with me reopening my laptop at midnight. Richard never demanded. He suggested. He trusted. He framed everything as collaboration. "You're the only one who sees the whole picture," he'd say. That sentence is dangerous when you want to feel important. The first time I pushed back was over something small. A vendor contract that clearly violated one of our internal controls. I flagged it, cited the policy, and suggested a revision. Richard listened, nodded thoughtfully, and then smiled. "I hear you," he said, "but we also need to be realistic." That was another phrase I learned to fear. The contract went through unchanged. My name went on the approval line. When I asked why, he leaned back in his chair and said, almost kindly, "Because if anyone asks questions, I want someone competent to answer them." I should have walked away right then, or at least documented the conversation, or told someone. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I handled it. I told myself it was temporary, that once I proved myself indispensable, I'd be protected, promoted, shielded. That loyalty moved upward as well as down. That belief lasted right up until the second inquiry arrived. This one wasn't polite. It wasn't curious. It was specific. It referenced dates, transactions, and language pulled directly from documents I'd prepared. Documents I'd prepared under instruction. I remember staring at the email, rereading my own words quoted back at me like evidence at a trial. My heart started racing in that quiet, clinical way that tells you your body understands the danger before your mind does. I forwarded it to Richard. He didn't respond for 6 hours. When he finally called me into his office, he didn't sit behind his desk. He sat beside me at the conference table, like we were equals, like we were partners. "This is frustrating," he said, "but it's manageable." "Manageable how?" I asked. He slid a folder toward me. Inside were talking points, a draft response, a timeline, and my name. Everywhere. "You want me to handle this?" I said carefully. "I need you to," he replied. "You're closest to it." I wanted to ask what would happen if things didn't go smoothly, if the inquiry escalated, if penalties were involved. Instead, I asked, "Shouldn't legal—" He cut me off gently. "Let's not overreact." That's when it hit me. Legal wasn't being looped in because legal would insist on names. Real ones. After that, the anxiety became background noise, a constant hum beneath everything I did. I checked my email compulsively. I jumped every time my phone rang from an unknown number. I started keeping copies of everything, though I didn't yet know why. It felt instinctual, like my brain was quietly preparing for a storm I didn't want to admit was coming. Around that time, Maya left. Maya had been there longer than me, sharp, outspoken, allergic to nonsense. On her last day, she stopped by my desk with a cardboard box and a tired smile. "Be careful," she said. "With what?" I asked. She hesitated. "With being good at fixing things." I laughed it off, made a joke about job security. She didn't laugh back. "They don't reward it," she said softly. "They exploit it." After she left, her responsibilities were divided up. Most of them landed with me. I started staying later. Saying no felt impossible. Every time I tried, Richard had a way of making it sound like the organization itself would suffer if I didn't step up, as if accountability were a finite resource and I was hoarding it selfishly. Here's the part that still feels absurd in hindsight. I was exhausted, anxious, and quietly terrified. And yet I felt guilty for feeling that way. Because on the outside, everything looked fine. Richard was thriving. The nonprofit was expanding. His media appearances increased. Articles praised his leadership. People told me how lucky I was to work for someone like him. Once, after a panel discussion, a donor shook my hand and said, "You must learn so much from Richard." I smiled and nodded while thinking about the unopened regulatory notice sitting in my inbox. That night, as I walked home, I wondered what would happen if I stopped responding. If I didn't smooth the edges. If I let one small problem remain unsolved. The thought scared me more than anything else. If you were in my place back then, watching responsibility quietly stack itself on your shoulders, while praise floated harmlessly above you, would you have said something? Or would you have convinced yourself this was just the price of being capable? I'm genuinely curious. Tell me what you would have done. Because at that point, I still believed I could outwork the risk. I didn't realize yet that the risk wasn't accidental. It was the job. By the time the third situation surfaced, I stopped calling them problems. Problems are unexpected. Problems surprise you. Problems imply there was a chance things might have gone differently. This felt curated. The email came in on a Thursday afternoon, just as most of the office was mentally checking out. Subject line neutral, language polite. But the attachment was heavy. Pages of questions, cross-referenced exhibits, requests for documentation going back nearly 2 years. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. Every reference pointed to processes I had managed. Every decision cited was one I had executed. The pattern was unmistakable. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long moment, listening to the low hum of the office air system. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. Someone else microwaved leftovers. The world continued, blissfully unaware that my stomach had just dropped through the floor. I walked into Richard's office without knocking. He was on a call, smiling, gesturing, his voice warm and confident. He held up one finger to me, just a second, and finished his sentence about ethical leadership. I waited. When he hung up, he turned to me, still smiling. "What's up?" I handed him the printed email. He skimmed it quickly. Too quickly. No surprise, no confusion, just a small tightening around the eyes, like someone adjusting their grip on something fragile. "Okay," he said. "We'll need to respond carefully." "We?" I asked. "Yes," he said smoothly. "You'll draft, I'll review." There it was again, that subtle slide, the responsibility moving sideways, never upward. "This is serious," I said. "They're asking about decisions that you handled," he finished for me, "which is why it makes sense for you to explain them." I took a breath. "Richard, my name is on all of this." He leaned back in his chair. "Because you're competent." The word landed differently this time. Less like praise, more like a diagnosis. "I need to know something," I said carefully. "If this escalates, what happens to me?" He tilted his head, studying me like I'd asked an odd question. "Escalates how?" "If there are penalties, or personal exposure." He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not catastrophize." That was when I realized he wasn't avoiding the question. He didn't need to answer it, because he already knew. Over the next few weeks, my life narrowed. I stopped going out after work. I stopped sleeping through the night. I started replaying conversations in my head, wondering which phrases could be taken out of context, which decisions could be framed as independent judgment instead of directed action. I began to understand something unsettling. Richard never told me what to do in writing. He suggested. He implied. He asked questions that only had one acceptable answer, and I had filled in the rest. There's a special kind of fear that comes from realizing you've been carefully trained to incriminate yourself. I started documenting everything. Screenshots, forwarded emails, calendar invites, notes scribbled in the margins of legal pads. I didn't know what I'd need or when, only that I needed something to anchor myself to reality, because the gaslighting had begun. "Why would you do it that way?" Richard asked in one meeting, flipping through a document I'd prepared under his explicit guidance. "That's how you told me to," I said. He frowned. "I don't remember saying that." Another time, a board member questioned a compliance gap. Richard turned to me. "Can you explain your thinking here?" My thinking. Not our decision. Not organizational strategy. Just mine. I explained. Carefully. Neutrally. I watched as Richard nodded along, the picture of engaged leadership, while quietly letting the narrative crystallize around me. I was the expert. I was the operator. I was the one closest to the details, which meant I was the one closest to the blast radius. Here's the absurd part, and this is where you're allowed to laugh, because I do now. I still felt bad for him. I told myself he was under pressure, that leadership was lonely, that he trusted me because he had no one else, that my stress was a sign of growth. I even joked to a friend that if this job didn't kill me, it would at least give me great posture from carrying so much invisible weight. She didn't laugh. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, I saw Richard through the glass wall of his office. He was practicing for a talk, gesturing, smiling, repeating lines about shared responsibility and ethical frameworks. I stood there for a moment, watching him rehearse sincerity like a performance. That was when the thought finally took shape, fully formed and impossible to ignore. He wasn't careless. He was careful. Every system was designed so that risk flowed downward and praise floated up. Every process ensured that when something broke, the brake would land on someone like me, someone capable, conscientious, and expendable. I went home that night and opened my laptop. I didn't draft a response. I didn't fix anything. I just stared at the screen and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for over a year. What would happen if I stopped being useful? The answer scared me, but not as much as the alternative, because for the first time, I understood the truth. This wasn't about loyalty. It was about containment, and I was the container. The next morning, nothing exploded. That was the first surprise. I woke up expecting panic, missed calls, frantic emails, some kind of immediate consequence from my quiet rebellion the night before. Instead, my phone was silent. The world hadn't noticed my hesitation. Gravity still worked. The sun still came up. My coffee tasted the same, which felt almost insulting under the circumstances. At the office, Richard greeted me the way he always did, warm, effortless, unconcerned. "Morning," he said, already halfway through a conversation with someone on his headset. No acknowledgement, no tension, no sign that he'd noticed I hadn't responded to the regulator's email overnight. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress does strange things to perception. Maybe I was catastrophizing. Maybe this really was just another routine issue that would resolve itself if I kept my head down. Then I opened my inbox. The follow-up had arrived at 7:14 a.m. Same sender, firmer tone, clearer deadlines, still addressed to me. I forwarded it to Richard. This time, he replied within minutes. "Let's discuss later today." No reassurance, no instructions, just delay. That delay stretched into the afternoon. Meetings filled the calendar, not mine, his. I watched him move from room to room, laughing, presenting, being exactly who everyone expected him to be. Meanwhile, the clock on my screen ticked steadily toward the response deadline. By 4:30, I was vibrating with restrained anxiety. At 4:47, Richard finally called me into his office. He closed the door behind me, sat down, and folded his hands like we were about to have a thoughtful, collaborative exchange. "I'd been thinking about this," he said, "and I think the best approach is to keep things simple." "Simple how?" I asked. "You respond," he said. "Stick to the facts, no speculation." "And you?" I asked. He smiled, just slightly. "I'll support you." That word again, support. It hovered in the air, vague and weightless, like a promise designed never to be tested. "I need clarity," I said. "If this escalates, if they start asking about decision-making authority—" "They won't," he interrupted. "Not if the response is clean." That was it. That was the line. Not if we've done nothing wrong. Not because the organization stands behind you, just, not if you do this right. I nodded. I left his office. I returned to my desk, and for the first time since I'd started working there, I didn't open a document. I sat still. It turns out doing nothing is incredibly loud when you're used to fixing everything. My brain screamed at me to act, to draft, to smooth, to anticipate. Years of conditioning kicked in, urging me to protect the system, a system that had never once protected me. I glanced around the office. People typing, phones ringing, someone laughing at a meme I couldn't see. The world still hadn't noticed my silence. At 5:12 p.m., Richard appeared at my desk. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Yes," I said. That was true in a narrow, technical sense. "The response?" he asked. "I'm still reviewing," I replied. He studied me for a beat longer than usual. Not angry, curious. "All right," he said. "Let me know if you need anything." Then he walked away. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was drafting responses in my head, I'd done enough of that for a lifetime, but because I was waiting. For retaliation, for pressure, for consequences. They came the next day. The regulator escalated, requested additional documentation, set a shorter deadline. Richard forwarded the email to me with a single sentence. "This is getting serious." I stared at the screen, waiting for the rest of the message. There was none. I closed my laptop. Here's where things got strange. When I didn't move, the system started to wobble. Legal finally got looped in, not by Richard but by the regulator. Questions started bouncing around without landing anywhere. Meetings were scheduled, then rescheduled, then canceled. For the first time, Richard didn't have clean answers ready. At one point, I overheard him in his office, voice low and tight, saying, "No, that was handled by operations." Operations. Me. Except I wasn't handling it anymore. And suddenly, everyone noticed the absence. It reminded me of that trick where you pull one Jenga block from the middle and the whole tower pretends it's fine for a second, right before it collapses. I wish I could tell you I felt powerful in that moment. Mostly, I felt nauseous. Because here was the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. If I stepped fully away, things would break. Not metaphorically, literally. Timelines would slip, explanations would fall apart, accountability would have nowhere to go. And the only reason they hadn't broken already was because I'd been holding them together with my own name. I also realized something else, equally unsettling. Richard wasn't angry, yet. He was confused. People like him don't expect resistance from the infrastructure. Doors don't argue. Floors don't refuse to hold weight. I'd spent so long being useful that I'd forgotten something fundamental. Usefulness is not protection. It's exposure. That afternoon, Richard called me again. This time, his tone was different, sharper, less polished. "We need to get ahead of this," he said. "I need you to step up." There it was, the expectation, the assumption, the quiet belief that I would always absorb the impact because that's what I'd been trained to do. I took a breath. "I can't," I said. Silence. I continued, choosing my words carefully, "I won't respond without legal guidance and written authorization." The pause on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke. "If you're going to make this difficult," he said slowly, "you should understand what that means for your position here." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, though there was something darkly comedic about being threatened for refusing to take responsibility for someone else's decisions, but because the mask had finally slipped. For the first time, Richard wasn't talking about ethics or trust or collaboration. He was talking about leverage. And now, at last, I knew exactly where I stood. Not beside him. In front of him. Between him and the consequences he'd spent years avoiding. That night I went home and organized every file I had into a single folder. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done pretending the weight was mine to carry. By the time I finished organizing the files, it was nearly midnight. I named the folder something boring, neutral, forgettable, the digital equivalent of beige paint. Not because I was hiding it, but because I'd learned that the most dangerous things are often the ones that look unremarkable. Inside were emails, attachments, calendar invites, drafts, red lines, and version histories. Threads where Richard suggested something verbally and followed up with, "Do what you think is best." Messages where I asked clarifying questions and received vague encouragement instead of direction. Files where my name appeared as the final authority, even though the decisions had been shaped long before they reached me. Looking at it all together made my chest tighten, not because I felt guilty, because I finally saw the architecture. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't bad management. It wasn't even negligence. It was design. Richard had built a system where accountability flowed downward and disappeared. A system where plausible deniability was baked into every process. He didn't need to issue illegal orders. He just needed people like me to want approval badly enough to fill in the blanks. And I had. The next day I came into the office with an unfamiliar calm. The kind that comes from accepting that something is already broken beyond repair. When you stop trying to save it, the fear changes shape. Richard didn't acknowledge me at first. He stayed in meetings, closed-door ones, the kind with frosted glass and low voices. People kept glancing at my desk, then looking away. By noon, legal finally asked to meet. It wasn't a dramatic summons, just a polite calendar invite with a vague subject line. I sat across from two attorneys I barely knew while they flipped through printed documents. "Can you walk us through your role in these decisions?" one of them asked. I answered honestly, carefully. I explained processes, timelines, and responsibilities. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I didn't protect anyone. I just described reality. They exchanged looks. "Were these directives given to you in writing?" the other asked. "No," I said, mostly verbally. "And who ultimately approved these actions?" I paused. "In practice?" I said slowly. "Me. In theory, everyone else." That meeting ended without resolution, which, I learned quickly, is never a good sign. Richard called me that afternoon. This time, there was no pretense. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Answering questions," I said. "You're creating a problem." "I didn't create it," I replied. "I inherited it." He exhaled sharply. "You're being naive. This isn't how things work." "How do they work?" I asked. A beat. Then, with unmistakable irritation. "People at your level don't get to decide when to stop being team players." There it was. Not leadership, not mentorship. Hierarchy. "You asked me to handle things," I said. "I did. Now I'm handling them honestly. That honesty," he snapped, "is going to cost you." I almost thanked him for finally saying it out loud. After the call, I went for a walk. I needed air, space, perspective. I watched people sit at outdoor cafes, laugh with coworkers, complain about deadlines that didn't carry legal consequences. For the first time in months, I realized how small my world had become. I'd been living inside his urgency. That evening, an email went out to the senior team. "Evan will be transitioning out of his role effective immediately." No explanation, no acknowledgement of my work, just a clean cut. I should have been devastated. Instead, I felt relieved. There's a strange freedom in being removed from a system that was actively consuming you. It's like being fired from a job you were already doing for free, emotionally, mentally, morally. The next few days were quiet, uncomfortably so. No more meetings, no more forwarded emails, no more quick questions that turned into unpaid crises. Then the calls started. Not from Richard, from people who suddenly needed information I had. From departments realizing that the person who knew how things worked was gone. From legal, asking follow-ups. And finally, from a journalist, Daniel Brooks. He introduced himself calmly, professionally, said he was working on a piece about governance failures in nonprofits with political influence. "I believe you may have insight," he said. I didn't answer right away. That night, I sat on my couch, staring at my phone. The room was quiet in a way that felt earned. For the first time in years, no one was waiting on me to clean up after them. If you were in my place right then, freshly pushed out, holding the full weight of the truth, knowing that speaking up could close doors forever, would you have stayed quiet to protect your future? Or would you have told it anyway, consequences be damned? I'd genuinely like to know. Say it out loud, or at least think it. Because here's the thing no one tells you. Silence doesn't just protect the powerful, it trains them. I called Daniel back. "I can talk," I said, "but only on the record." He paused, just long enough to understand what that meant. "I thought you might say that," he replied. We scheduled a meeting. I hung up and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing it, and somewhere, deep down, I knew this was the moment where the story stopped being about survival and started becoming about consequence. Not mine, his. Meeting a journalist is a lot less cinematic than movies make it seem. There were no trench coats, no shadowy corners, no whispered passwords. Daniel Brooks showed up 10 minutes early, ordered black coffee, and chose a table by the window like a man who had nothing to hide and very little left to lose. That should have warned me. "I want to be clear," he said after we sat down. "I don't promise outcomes. I promise accuracy." I nodded. That's more than I've gotten lately. He smiled faintly, not amused, more familiar. We didn't start with Richard. We started with me. My role, my responsibilities, my access, my name on documents. Daniel asked precise questions, the kind that told me he already knew most of the answers and was checking for consistency. Every so often he'd stop and say that again, slower. When I showed him the folder, his expression didn't change. He didn't gasp, he didn't react at all, which somehow felt worse. "This isn't a smoking gun," he said finally. "It's a map." "A map to what?" "To intent," he replied, "and patterns." That word again. Patterns. I'd spent years thinking I was unlucky, or overly anxious, or just bad at handling pressure. Seeing my experience framed as part of something repeatable, intentional, made my skin prickle. "What happens now?" I asked. Daniel took a sip of coffee. "Now I verify everything, independently, slowly." "And Richard?" "He'll sense something before he sees it," Daniel said. "People like him always do." He was right. 2 days later, Richard emailed me. Subject line, "Let's reset." The body of the message was almost charming. He expressed disappointment, concern, a desire to clear the air. He praised my work, acknowledged my stress, suggested we'd both been under pressure and perhaps things had gotten misaligned. He ended with, "We should meet." Privately. I read it twice, then laughed out loud in my kitchen. It wasn't a happy laugh. More the kind you make when you realize a magician has just asked you to put the card back in the deck and pretend you didn't see the trick. I didn't respond. That's when the tone changed. The next email was colder, shorter. It referenced confidentiality agreements and professional conduct. The one after that hinted, very gently of course, at reputational consequences. I forwarded them to Daniel. "Good," he said. "This helps." Meanwhile, the organization started unraveling in small bureaucratic ways. Deadlines slipped. Explanations contradicted each other. People who'd never needed to explain themselves before suddenly couldn't agree on who'd approved what. And without me there to quietly translate chaos into compliance, things got messy. One board member emailed asking for documentation I'd maintained. Another asked if I was available for a quick call. I declined both. Here's where the humor comes in, if you can call it that. I'd spent years being invisible. Now that I was gone, I was suddenly very popular. It turns out being the only person who understands a broken system makes you indispensable, right up until you stop participating. Daniel's article progressed. He never showed me drafts. He never asked me to shape the narrative. He verified, cross-checked, confirmed timelines with third parties, pulled public records. One afternoon, he called me with a question. "Did Richard ever explicitly instruct you to misrepresent information?" "No," I said. "Did he ever stop you when you raised concerns?" "No." Daniel exhaled. "That's what I thought." The story wasn't about orders. It was about abdication. Around this time, Maya reached out. We hadn't spoken since she left. Her message was short. "I heard some things. Are you okay?" We met for drinks. She listened while I talked, eyes steady, jaw tight. When I finished, she shook her head. "He tried to do it to me too. I just didn't last as long." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. She smiled sadly. "I thought no one would believe me." That night I went home and sat in silence longer than usual. Because here's the truth I was circling but hadn't fully named yet. Richard didn't just rely on my silence. He relied on my isolation. on my belief that I was alone in this, that I was the only one who felt the pressure, the fear, the creeping sense of being set up to fail quietly. I wasn't. And once that illusion cracked, everything shifted. The first sign came in the form of a polite email from legal. They wanted to clarify authorship on several documents. Then came a request from the board for a timeline of approvals. Then, finally, a message from Richard that didn't bother pretending. "You're making a serious mistake." I didn't reply. I was done participating in conversations designed to erase me. Daniel called a week later. "It's publishing soon," he said. "Am I named?" I asked. "No," he said, "but your role is clear." "And him?" A pause. "Yes." I thanked him and hung up. That night I slept better than I had in years, not because I felt safe, but because for the first time, the weight wasn't mine alone. The system was being forced to carry itself, and it was already starting to buckle. The article went live on a Tuesday morning. That detail matters, because Tuesdays are when people pretend they're productive while secretly scrolling. It's the perfect day for something inconvenient to land. I found out because my phone started vibrating on the kitchen counter like it was trying to escape. Texts, missed calls, Slack notifications from channels I'd already been removed from. Someone even tried to FaceTime me, which felt aggressive under the circumstances. I didn't open the article right away. I made coffee first. Toast, too. Buttered it carefully. Sat down. Took a bite. Only then did I click the link Daniel had sent with a single line. "It's out." The headline didn't scream. That was the first thing I noticed. No dramatic language, no accusations in all caps, just a calm, surgical description of governance failures, accountability gaps, and a leadership structure that funneled risk downward while concentrating praise at the top. Richard's name appeared exactly 7 paragraphs in, not as a villain, not as a monster, as a man who delegated extensively and maintained strategic distance from operational decision-making. I laughed out loud at that. Strategic distance. I'd like to trademark that phrase and put it on a mug. As I kept reading, I saw the shape of my own experience reflected back at me, not emotionally, but structurally. The patterns Daniel had warned me about were laid bare. Multiple former employees, similar timelines, identical phrases. "You're smart. You're closest to it. Handle it." I wasn't special. I was a template. By noon, the organization released a statement. It said they took the concern seriously. It said they were committed to transparency. It said they'd initiated an internal review. Richard was temporarily stepping back. Temporarily. Another word that did a lot of work. By mid-afternoon, donors were asking questions. By evening, board members were leaking anonymous comments about being misled. Everyone was shocked. Everyone had no idea. Everyone had been blindsided. Watching powerful people discover gravity in real time is educational. Richard called me that night. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. His voice was calmer than I expected. Controlled. Measured. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "We could have handled it internally." I replayed that line 3 times. Internally. Meaning quietly. Meaning without consequences. Meaning with me absorbing the fallout, like always. The next few days blurred together. More articles, follow-ups, commentary pieces, people debating leadership ethics on panels Richard used to sit on. One clip went viral where a commentator said, "This appears to be a case of leadership by omission." I nearly choked on my water. Leadership by omission. There it was again, a polite phrase trying to describe something deeply ugly. I got emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some were supportive, some were cautious. A few were transparently self-serving. One former colleague wrote, "I always knew something was off." Of course you did. Another asked if I'd be willing to chat informally about a role at their organization. That one almost made me cry. Not because of the opportunity, but because it proved something I'd been too afraid to believe before. I wasn't radioactive. I was free. Meanwhile, Richard's narrative started to fracture. At first, he framed himself as overwhelmed, then as betrayed, then as misunderstood. Each version contradicted the last. The more he spoke, the less coherent it became. At one point, he released a statement emphasizing how young and inexperienced some of his staff had been. I stared at that line for a long time. So that was the angle. Not denial, not apology. Deflection downward. It didn't land the way he expected. People noticed. Commentators noticed. Former employees noticed. Maya texted me a link to a thread full of stories eerily similar to ours. "Looks familiar," she wrote. It did. What struck me most wasn't the outrage, it was the recognition. People weren't shocked that this had happened. They were shocked that it had been named. There's a strange comfort in realizing your worst experience isn't unique. It doesn't make it hurt less, exactly, but it does take away the shame. The sense that you failed some invisible test of resilience. One afternoon, I ran into a former board liaison at the grocery store. We stood in front of the frozen foods, pretending not to be in the middle of something deeply awkward. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't realize." I believed her, which was new. For a long time, I'd assumed everyone saw what was happening and chose to ignore it. Now I understood something more complicated and more dangerous. Many of them didn't see it at all, because the system was designed so they wouldn't have to. Without me quietly translating, smoothing, buffering, and fixing, the gaps were impossible to ignore. Meetings stalled, explanations unraveled, processes that had always worked suddenly didn't. It wasn't that Richard had been holding everything together. It was that I had. And without that invisible labor, the illusion collapsed. The funniest part, and I don't use that word lightly, was watching people search for a replacement. Someone else to step into the role, someone capable, someone who could absorb the mess without asking too many questions. Good luck with that. One evening, as I sat on my couch watching the news cycle move on to its next crisis, my phone buzzed again. A message from Richard. Just 4 words. Was it worth it? I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because for the first time, he wasn't the one who needed to hear it. The system already had. By the end of that week, the internal review had a name. So did the investigation. That's when people stopped using words like miscommunication and process failure and started reaching for heavier language. The kind that comes with lawyers who don't smile and calendars that suddenly fill months in advance. I found out the same way I'd found out most things during this ordeal, indirectly. A former colleague texted me a screenshot of an internal memo that had already been accidentally forwarded to half the staff. Richard Hale was no longer stepping back. He was on leave. Indefinite leave, which in institutional language means, "We're hoping this goes away, but we're not confident it will." The board released another statement, this one longer, more carefully worded. It emphasized cooperation, transparency, a commitment to rebuilding trust. They did not mention me. That was fine. I wasn't interested in credit anymore. Credit is just another way systems keep you attached. What I wanted was distance. Still, the ripples kept finding me. Daniel called again. "They're expanding the scope." "Meaning?" "Meaning your documents weren't the outlier. They were the connective tissue." I closed my eyes. "So it's bigger than him?" "Yes," Daniel said. "But he's still central." That night, I went through the folder again, not to add anything, but to remind myself why I'd done this. It's easy to doubt your own decisions when the noise gets loud, when strangers argue about your life like it's an abstract concept. Scrolling through those emails felt different now. They no longer looked like traps. They looked like fingerprints. Patterns only stay invisible as long as someone keeps erasing them. I hadn't erased anything. I'd just stepped aside. A few days later, I got an email from legal. This one wasn't vague. It wasn't polite. It wasn't framed as a casual request. They wanted a formal statement. I sat at my desk, rereading the message, and felt something unexpected rise up. Not fear, annoyance. Not at them, at the sheer predictability of it all. The system had finally reached the stage where it needed clarity, and suddenly my voice mattered. I agreed to cooperate, on my terms. The interview took 3 hours. They asked about timelines, approvals, communications, expectations. I answered carefully, neutrally, and without embellishment. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't diagnose intent. I just described what happened. When it was over, one of the attorneys leaned back and said, almost casually, "You understand this could have gone very badly for you." I looked at him. "It almost did." He nodded. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement, just recognition, which, at that point, felt sufficient. Around the same time, Richard broke his silence. He gave an interview, not to a journalist, to a friendly outlet, someone who owed him favors. He talked about burnout, about the pressures of leadership, about how difficult it is to manage young professionals who lack perspective. I watched the clip twice. The first time, I felt that old familiar twist in my stomach, the urge to correct the narrative, to defend myself, to jump in and explain. The second time, I noticed something else. He never denied the facts. He reframed them. That's when I understood that even now, even cornered, Richard wasn't trying to prove he was right. He was trying to prove he was reasonable, which might be the most dangerous move of all. The response was swift. Former employees spoke up. Not dramatically, not angrily, just plainly. Threads emerged, stories aligned, the same phrases, the same dynamics, different names, same shape. It turns out the internet has a keen eye for patterns. One post summed it up perfectly. This isn't bad leadership. This is leadership optimized for offloading blame. I saved that one. Humor has a way of sneaking in during moments like this. Dark humor, the kind that keeps you sane. At one point, a friend sent me a meme of a cartoon bridge labeled "Accountability," with a stick figure tossing all the weight onto someone else's shoulders. I laughed harder than I probably should have. Not because it was funny, because it was accurate. As the weeks passed, the story began to shift. Less about scandal, more about structure. Commentators talked about how organizations reward people who create the illusion of control without bearing its costs. About how competence gets exploited while charisma gets promoted. It was strange, watching my private hell turn into a public case study. I got an offer during that time, a small consulting firm, quiet, no flashy titles, no grand missions. The hiring manager said, "We're looking for someone who understands systems and isn't afraid to question them." I accepted, not because I needed the job, because I liked the sentence. On my last day of unemployment, a phrase I never thought I'd use without panic, I went for a walk through the city. Past buildings I'd once entered with a knot in my stomach, past offices where I'd felt small and replaceable. I felt lighter. Not victorious, not triumphant, just untethered. That evening, my phone buzzed one more time. A notification from Daniel. Final update. Formal findings expected soon. He's done. I stared at the message for a long moment. Not out of satisfaction. Out of something quieter. Completion. This wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a grand reversal of fortunes. Richard would be fine. People like him always land somewhere soft. But the system had lost one thing it couldn't easily replace. A willing container. And once you remove that, everything else has to rebalance, whether it wants to or not. The formal findings dropped on a Friday afternoon. Another detail that matters. Friday is when institutions hope bad news will dissolve into weekend noise. People log off, attention drifts. By Monday, the outrage is supposed to be tired. This time, it didn't work. The report was long, dense, painfully precise. It avoided emotional language entirely, which somehow made it hit harder. Page after page outlined governance failures, abdicated oversight, and a consistent pattern of delegating operational authority without corresponding accountability. Richard's name appeared often. Not in bold, not with adjectives, just present, repeated, inescapable. The conclusion didn't call him evil. It didn't speculate about his character. It did something far more damaging. It stated that under his leadership, risk had been systematically displaced onto subordinates in ways that exposed them to disproportionate personal and professional harm. That sentence felt like an exhale I'd been holding for years. By Monday morning, he had resigned. Not fired, resigned. People like Richard rarely get fired. They're allowed to exit with dignity, statements crafted to preserve future options. Still, resignation is resignation. The organization announced structural reforms, new oversight committees, revised approval processes, mandatory documentation of decision authority. Words that sounded promising and exhausting at the same time. Too late for me, but maybe not for the next person. I didn't feel celebratory. I didn't pop champagne or text anyone I told you so. Mostly, I felt quiet. The adrenaline that had carried me through months of tension finally wore off, and what replaced it wasn't joy. It was something closer to grief. Not for Richard, for the version of myself that thought competence would be enough. I started my new job that week. Smaller office, fewer glass walls, no grand mission statement printed in brushed metal near the entrance. On my first day, my manager handed me a document and said, "If anything here doesn't make sense, let's talk it through." I almost asked him to repeat himself. Instead, I nodded and took my seat, mildly suspicious, like someone offered a chair after years of standing and unsure whether it was a trick. The work was quieter, slower. No one praised me for staying late. No one implied the organization would collapse if I took a day off. At first, that felt wrong. Then it felt healthy. Occasionally, updates about the investigation filtered through industry chatter. Richard's name stopped appearing in headlines. He issued a final statement about personal growth and lessons learned. I noticed he never mentioned the people who'd carried the weight for him. That consistency, at least, was impressive. Maya and I stayed in touch. We'd meet for coffee and talk about everything except work for the first half hour, like two people relearning how to exist without constant pressure. One afternoon, she said, "You know what the wildest part is?" "What?" "He probably still thinks this happened to him." I laughed. A real laugh this time. "Yeah," I said. "I'm sure he does." Humor creeps back in slowly after things like this. Not jokes exactly, more perspective. I found myself amused by small things again. A calendar reminder that didn't induce panic. An email that didn't feel like a trap. The novelty of leaving work while the sun was still up. Once, during a team meeting, someone said, "Let's make sure we're not setting anyone up to fail." And I had to look down at my notes to hide a smile. Growth, I suppose. A few weeks later, Daniel and I met one last time. Not for an interview, just coffee. "The story's mostly done," he said. "The cycle's moved on." "Does that bother you?" I asked. He shrugged. "No. Systems don't change because of outrage. They change because the math stops working." I thought about that on the walk home. The math had stopped working because I'd stepped away. Not dramatically, not heroically, just deliberately. That realization settled something deep in my chest. For a long time, I'd framed what happened as courage versus fear, speaking up versus staying silent. But that wasn't quite right. The real shift hadn't been in what I said. It had been in what I refused to keep doing. I refused to translate chaos into clarity for someone else's benefit. I refused to lend my credibility to decisions I didn't control. I refused to carry consequences that weren't mine. And when I stopped, the system revealed itself. Not because I attacked it, because I withdrew from it. That's the part people don't like to talk about. We celebrate whistleblowers and truth-tellers, but we rarely acknowledge the quieter power of non-participation. The moment when you stop being the thing that makes a bad structure viable. Richard didn't fall because I pushed him. He fell because there was nothing left underneath him. On a random Thursday, months later, I deleted the beige folder. Not out of fear, not to erase anything, because I didn't need it anymore. The weight I'd carried was gone. The story had resolved itself, not with fireworks, but with consequences distributed where they belonged. I closed my laptop and looked around my apartment. Quiet. Ordinary. Mine. And for the first time since this all began, that felt like more than enough. The strange thing about the end of something like this is how little it announces itself. There was no final phone call, no dramatic apology, no moment where the universe neatly tied a bow around the experience and labeled it closure. Life simply continued. Quieter, less urgent, more mine. I didn't run into Richard again. I heard about him occasionally, the way you hear about distant weather. A consulting role here, an advisory board there. Nothing public-facing. Nothing that required moral authority. He had landed somewhere soft, as expected. People like him always do. And you know what? That was fine. Because the story had never really been about where he ended up. It was about where I did. In the months that followed, I started to notice the absence of certain feelings. The constant low-grade panic was gone. The impulse to check my email before getting out of bed faded. I stopped bracing for impact every time my phone buzzed. At first, the calm felt suspicious. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to tell me I'd miscalculated, that I'd overreacted, that there would be consequences I hadn't anticipated. They never came. What did come were smaller, quieter shifts. I started sleeping through the night. I caught myself humming while doing the dishes. I laughed at jokes that had nothing to do with coping. Once, during a meeting at my new job, someone asked who wanted to take ownership of a risky project. There was a pause. Not the tense kind, just a pause. I didn't raise my hand, and no one looked at me like I'd failed a test. That might have been the most radical moment of all. I thought a lot about responsibility during that time, about how it gets framed as a virtue, when really it's just a function. Responsibility without authority isn't moral, it's mechanical, it turns people into parts. I'd spent years being a very efficient part. Now, I was just a person. One evening, I ran into a former colleague from the old organization at a bookstore. We stood awkwardly between shelves, both pretending we weren't doing mental math about whether this interaction required small talk. "I'm glad you're doing okay," she said finally. "Me too," I replied. She hesitated. "You know, a lot of things changed after you left." I nodded. I heard. "They're more careful now," she said. "About who signs what. About expectations." I smiled. Not proudly, just quietly. "That's good," I said. On the walk home, I thought about that. About how the impact of saying no isn't always immediate or visible. Sometimes it shows up as guardrails someone else doesn't even realize exist. I never became a cautionary tale, or a hero, or a case study in a business school lecture. I became something much less interesting. Unexploitable. There's humor in that, if you look closely. For years, I'd been told I was indispensable. Turns out the most disruptive thing I ever did was make myself unavailable. Every now and then, someone asks me if I regret it. If I regret not staying quiet, not playing along a little longer, not protecting the relationships that might have been useful later. I think about that version of myself, the one hunched over a laptop at midnight, fixing problems he didn't create for people who wouldn't protect him. And the answer comes easily. No. What I regret is how long it took me to realize that being capable doesn't obligate you to be consumed, that loyalty doesn't mean self-erasure, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop making it easier for others to avoid the consequences of their choices. I didn't burn anything down. I didn't expose secrets for sport. I didn't demand justice with a raised voice or a clenched fist. I stepped away. And in doing so, I learned something I wish I'd known earlier. Systems don't collapse because someone attacks them. They collapse when the people holding them up decide they deserve better. These days, my life is smaller, and richer for it. I go to work, I do my job, I leave on time. I have hobbies that don't involve crisis management. I have relationships that don't depend on how much weight I can carry without complaining. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how close I came to disappearing into someone else's narrative. How easily it could have ended differently if I'd just kept my head down a little longer. Then I turn off the light and go to sleep. Because the story is over. Not with revenge, not with redemption, but with something far more rare. Enough. I want to leave you with this before we part ways. For a long time, I thought stories like mine were rare. Dramatic outliers that only happen to unlucky people in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't believe that anymore. I think stories like this are everywhere. They just don't always get told out loud. If you've ever been the person who held everything together, if you've ever been praised for being reliable while quietly paying the price for it, if you've ever wondered whether walking away would destroy your future or finally give you one, then this story wasn't just mine, it was ours. I share these stories not because I enjoy reliving them, but because naming these patterns is how they lose their power. Silence keeps systems intact. Understanding weakens them. If this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in even one moment of what you heard, consider subscribing to this channel. Not for drama, not for outrage, but for clarity. There are more stories like this coming. Stories about power, responsibility, quiet manipulation, and the moments people decide they've carried enough. Subscribe if you want to keep listening. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing the patterns. And if you've lived something similar, you're not alone, even if it felt that way at the time. I'll see you in the next story.